The 1980s was the era of excess. There's that old saying of, if you remember the 80s, you weren't there. And that era is considered to be the peak for things like music and for motorsport. Slash's autobiography put it best. It might seem excessive, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Bands like Guns N' Roses, Motley Crue and others where it's a case of, how are you still alive? With Steven Adler being kicked out of Guns N' Roses for doing too many drugs. Which is a bit like being done for speeding at the Indy 500 or being done for assault in a UFC fight. But that's actually not the worst of it, because Lemmy, the bassist in Motorhead, was kicked out of Hawkwind for being on the wrong drugs. Crazy. But in motorsport, it was the era of the turbos, and the 1980s went turbo crazy. I've covered Formula 1's 1.5 litre hand grenades before, and one of the jokes in comment sections on my videos is adding around 100 horsepower to the figures every so often, because the internet has got a habit of, well, let's say exaggerating some of the numbers. YouTubers doing it as well, claiming 1800 horsepower in some instances. And I do get asked where I'm seeing this stuff because the people asking haven't seen it themselves. Well, just because you're not seeing it doesn't mean it's not happening. And it's been going on for, well, a very long time. And even if the videos and articles do get the power figures close to what they actually were, any reports of those power figures being used in races are flat out false. Qualifying? Yes. In the race? No. Just no. But outside of Formula 1, it was going turbo crazy elsewhere. Group C, with the Porsche 956 and 962 being the kings of endurance racing for a time. Nobody's Perfect poster, etc. The legends of Stefan Beloff, Jackie Ickx, Derek Bell and company lobbing cars around the public roads of France in July, and that series dying out because the cost just got too much, and the FIA and Formula 1 trying to devise this equivalency formula for engines that led to the cost skyrocketing further and manufacturers leaving for Formula 1. And personnel, as it so happens. Todd, Brawn, Walkinshaw, Schumacher. And there is, of course, the Group B era of rally. If the F1 turbos were insane, the Group B stuff took it and cranked it beyond 11. This coming after Audi started the four-wheel drive revolution in rallying, becoming the blueprint for everything since. And Peugeot, Lancia, MG and others building these purpose-built rally versions of existing road cars that were mid-engined, four-wheel drive and just monstrously powerful, with about 3 to 5 business days of turbo lag. Rally as a whole exploded in popularity, but it ended abruptly with spectator deaths and the death of Henry Toivonen. But it wasn't just in rally that this happened, Formula 1 had the turbos reined in as well. But one other place where turbos ran rampant was touring cars. Group A touring cars was a little like Group B rally in that the cars were very powerful, but unlike Group B rally, the cars were the cars that they were, if you follow me. Basically, what you had was a BMW 3 Series, a Holden Commodore or a Nissan Skyline on the outside, but inside they were modified for maximum performance. The cars had to be based off production cars, essentially, which is not too far removed from what the NGTC rules are in the BTCC today. Yes, they've got some extra bits bolted on and that's not the original engine, but when you look at it from the outside, that's still a Cupra Leon, that's still a Ford Focus, that's still a Vauxhall Astra. To comply with the rulebook, manufacturers would release something called the Homologation Special. Special versions of the car that would be racing in a particular series that existed just to meet the minimum build requirements. In the Australian Touring Car Championship, now V8 supercars or just supercars, Ford and Holden would often release special Bathurst editions of the Falcon, Tirana, Commodore or whatever model they were using, just so they could run a specially tuned model at the Bathurst 1000. While Group B had these, well, I like to call them LMP ones on dirt, at least the Group A cars were a bit more affordable. Several of these cars were released, just so the manufacturers had the best chance of winning. Some of these cars include the Opel Omega Evo 500, Volvo 240 Turbo, Skyline R31, the Rover SD1 Vitesse, which I got to see at Silverstone back in May when I was there, and even an Audi V8. All of them being successful in their own way, with the Rover winning at Bathurst one year. And that's the one that always makes me laugh. It's a Rover. I'm surprised it lasted long enough to make it to the end of the first lap at Bathurst. And one of the most eulogised of these Group A cars is the Ford Sierra RS500 Cosworth, one of the most dominant cars of the 1980s. The RS500 Cosworth was developed off the back of the standard Sierra RS Cosworth, which had begun production in 1986 after the first plans for it were drawn up in 1983. Stuart Turner was the head of the project and had been given the job as the Ford Motorsport boss in Europe. Ford had lost its position as one of the top motorsport manufacturers in recent times, because Renault had started the turbo revolution in Formula 1, and in rally, Audi and later Peugeot and Lancia were kicking Ford's arses. Ford had not won a Formula 1 title since 1982, and not won the WRC since 1979. And in touring cars, they weren't doing particularly great either. The RS Cosworth had received the backing of Walter Hayes, who had been behind the GT40 and Cosworth DFV projects. Ken Kors was also drafted in, and he went and spoke to Ford's mates over at Cosworth to see what they could come up with, and Cosworth was tasked with building the engine to their own specifications. Cosworth took the T88 engine block and started modifying it to fit the brief of having around 180 horsepower for road legal cars and upwards of 300 horsepower for racing versions. Cosworth said no to 180 horsepower, saying they wouldn't get out of bed for less than 200, and Ford had to commit to 15,000 engines. This allowed Ford to do a couple of generations of the car, but the initial uptake from the dealers was actually pretty poor. Ford needed to build and sell 5,000 units to be eligible for Group A touring cars. The initial uptake from the dealer network was only around 1,500 cars, which is obviously a lot less, but they managed to build the cars and they managed to sell them. Well, 500 of these cars were taken away and modified slightly. The power was increased by Tickford, and the body modified to make it look more aggressive and also help with cooling the engine, and the distinctive whale tail had a second spoiler for some added downforce. The power was up to around 225 horsepower, with around 200 pound-foot of torque at 4,500 revs. Exactly 500 of these cars were made, and they're absolutely mad looking. They look fast even before they start moving. I bet they cost a bit now though. There's actually one on Auto Trader for 60 grand, if you're interested. When it was put into racing mode for Group A touring car racing, the rear downforce was needed. Ford wanted to use the Sierra because it was rear-wheel drive and also for the aero properties of the car. But even with the rear downforce available, Andy Rouse was still sliding the thing around on track. He described it as functional, but that's about it. The amount of horsepower and torque relative to the amount of mechanical, aero and tyre grip was incredibly high, so being careful out of slow corners was vital. Otherwise, you would just leave a long set of black tyre marks on the road. To get it race ready, Ford added some bigger turbos and played around with the engine mapping. This took the initial 225 horsepower or so up to around 485 horsepower, which is, quite the jump. And while you're oofing from behind your computer, TV, phone or iPad screens, I'll let you recover slightly, before I then tell you that when Ford had finished fiddling with the engine maps and turbos, they'd got it to 500 horsepower, then 525 for peak horsepower and reliability. Current BTCC cars have around 350 horsepower, but that can vary depending on what they're doing, and can hit speeds of around 160 miles an hour. Some reports put a modern BTCC car at around 400 horsepower. Steve Soper told Motorsport magazine that any reports of this car having above 550 horsepower in the BTCC are greatly exaggerated. A bit like some of these articles and videos you see about the F1 turbos. To manage all of that power, the RS500 Group A car needed 4 separate coolers. 2 to keep the engine oil temperature under control, then 1 for the gearbox oil and 1 for the diff oil. And inside, it was bare minimum. Anything that could be considered excess weight was taken out, and the body was welded to within an inch of its life to stiffen it up. At the end of it all, Ford had made a monster that made the Nissan GTR known as Godzilla look like a small lizard. The RS500 Cosworth was like the Gorn in Star Trek Strange New Worlds. It's coming through. You ain't stopping it. With all that power coming from the engine and all that torque, the cars were absolutely rapid. When the car was taken to Bathurst in 1987, it was around 5 miles an hour faster than the other cars as it hit the brakes for the chase. In 1987, the chicane at the chase had been added, which dropped the speeds down slightly. But even then, the Australians were topping out at around 184 miles an hour, while the Texaco RS500s were nudging 190. Today, the modern V8 supercars are hitting around something in the region of about 185 miles an hour or so, which is 300 kilometres there or thereabouts. While the cars are slower in a straight line, they're faster over the top of the mountain by a considerable margin, and under braking. When the RS500 went to Fuji for a round of the World Touring Car Championship, it managed to hit 200 miles an hour in a straight line. A touring car doing 200 miles an hour. GT1s could top out at 200 miles an hour, but they needed the Straits of Le Mans to be able to do it. 28 of these cars were initially prepped and sent across the world. The continent, Britain, Japan, Australia, they went everywhere, with one such car ending up in the hands of Dick Johnson Racing in Australia. Dick Johnson was the Ford guy in Australia and was known to have some of the fastest Fords in the world, not just down under. For those not aware, Dick Johnson was the guy who hit a rock at Bathurst in 1980, and through crowdfunding from the Australian public on both Team Blue and Team Red, he managed to rebuild the car and won Bathurst the next year. Andy Rouse had the fastest Sierra in Britain. Dick Johnson, meanwhile, in 1987 was using the older standard Sierra Cosworth and was buying parts from Rouse in England, which later became a logistics problem given the distance between the two countries. The other problem with the older car is that it was a bit fragile and needed nursing. The gearbox would often give up, and in 1987 Johnson reckoned he went through 37 turbos. Johnson came over to Britain during 1987 and asked Rouse if he could have all the same gear that Andy was using, to which Rouse said no. At Bathurst for the James Hardy 1000 in 1987, the Australian cars were royally trounced by their European Group A counterparts, but the Eggenberger cars were then disqualified from the race for illegally modifying their front wheel arches. This handed the win to the Holden dealer team VL Commodore of Peter McLeod, Peter Brock, David Parsons and John Crook. It was a controversial decision because the Texaco Sierras had been doing it legally all year, but only at Bathurst had it become a problem. Now the cynics among you will probably be thinking that it was all a bit convenient. The European team disqualified to hand it to an Australian one that represented the Australian company. Sort of. Technically that Holden team shouldn't have existed because of GM rules, but it is what it is, and Eggenberger was still protesting that disqualification into 1988. DJR got RS500s for the 1988 Australian Touring Car Championship, and it proved to be fast. Very fast. And the DJR Sierra RS500s won all but one race in the Australian Touring Car Championship in 1988. And with the Sierras from Europe having destroyed the homegrown cars at Bathurst in 1987, Johnson decided that he was going to do the same to the British in their own back garden. At the RAC Trophy at Silverstone, Johnson beat the European cars to pole by 4/10 and then romped away during the race, only to break down when the cooling system packed in. They finished 21st overall, but they proved their point. The Aussie cars were faster. Probably because Johnson's cars had about another 50 or 60 horsepower compared to the British cars. There are claims of the DJR cars having upwards of 600 horsepower. Johnson went back to Australia, and in 1989 he did what he did in 1988. He destroyed the field and took a Bathurst win as well. It was a Bathurst win where he and John Bowe led every single lap of that 161 lap race. But the RS500's Aussie dominance was going to come to an end pretty quickly, because the competition from Japan was emerging. Godzilla. In 1992, CAMS started tightening the rulebook, adding more minimum weight and restricting speeds, and this left Johnson winless in 1991. In 1992, the car bowed out in a controversial Bathurst 1000. Long story short, the race was red flagged in torrential rain. On the lap in which the red flag came out, the Godzilla that was leading the race crashed, but when they took the result from the last counted lap 2 laps before, Godzilla was leading, so the Nissan Skyline won the race. The crowd in attendance didn't particularly like that decision, and then on the podium, Jimmy Richards, who won the race with Mark Scaife, called the crowd a pack of arseholes. Although Richards was a little bit, emotionally charged, because his friend Denny Hulme, who won the 1967 Formula 1 World Championship, died of a heart attack during that race. Meanwhile, in Europe, things remained, somewhat stable for the RS500s. It won DTM in 1988 with Klaus Ludwig and destroyed the Mercedes and BMW cars. But there were complaints from Munich and Stuttgart, so the Fords were hit with weight and turbo penalties to the point where it was unable for the Fords to be competitive. So at the end of 1989, Ford pulled out. But in Britain, it was even more competitive. It won the Class A title in 1988 in the BTCC, but Frank Sittner in the BMW won the title overall, because of how the point system functioned in those days. Rouse, meanwhile, was third overall, but won his class. Now this is the issue with the BTCC in those days. It's just, it's complicated. I've done a video on it in the past. To try and put this into its most basic terms, Andy Rouse won every single race bar 3 in 1988, but Frank Sittner won the title without winning a race at all. I know, right? Basically, the class winner got the same points as the race winner, So at the end of the first race of the season, you'd have 3, 4, 5 drivers, all on the same amount of points. Sittner won his class in every race except for one. Rouse came 16th and 10th in a couple of races, so dropped more points. Now forgive me here because I now need to read directly off my screen to better explain this to you. So at Alton Park you had Andy Rouse who finished first. He won the race. He crossed the line in first place. He won. Sittner meanwhile finished 6th. But Sittner and Rouse both got the same amount of points. Although I think the BTCC changed things slightly at this point so that lower classes actually ended up getting more points than the actual race winner, which doesn't make any sense at all. In 1989, you had John Cleland winning the championship, but he was in Class C, so in a slower car, but won the championship. Rob Gravett, who won in 1989, he was in Class A, well, he won the Class A category, but he finished 3rd overall. Make that make sense. Such was the way of the championship being the way it was. The Sierra was destroying the field, winning 9 out of 12 rounds in 1987, but the point system said otherwise. As it was, the Sierra only won the Drivers' Championship in the BTCC once, when Rob Gravett won it in 1990. So it might look like the RS500 wasn't a particularly dominant car. It was. It's just that the BTCC's convoluted point system meant that guys like John Cleland, Frank Sittner, Chris Hodgetts and so on are listed as the champions instead. Hodgetts won the 1987 title in a Class D Toyota Corolla, although the RS500 was only used at the end of the 1987 season. The stats are that the RS500 won 84.6% of the races it entered, according to Motorsport magazine, and in the BTCC, no other car scored an outright win for 3 full years. It resulted in Class A in the British Touring Car Championship basically becoming the RS500 Cup, because the other cars simply couldn't compete with the power levels and the drivability. The drivers all thought that it was the best thing they'd ever hopped into, and the fans still love it even to this day. And if you ever get to see one up close, it's an amazing bit of kit. But touring cars in Britain were in a state of transition. While Rob Gravett did win the 1990 championship in an RS500, a rookie white RS500 it has to be said because it barely had any sponsors on it, the RS500's days were numbered. In 1990, the BTCC had debuted the new Class 2 touring car category. Class 2 is the FIA's designation for these cars, but the term we tend to use is Super Touring. This was a return to production cars that the general public could actually buy, with it being back to a more win on Sunday, sell on Monday mentality. Super Tourers were allowed into the BTCC starting from 1990, and the Group A cars were reeled in to bring them in line with the Super Touring performance numbers. As a result, when Super Touring kicked off properly in 1991, BMW and Vauxhall were slightly ahead of the game compared to the other manufacturers, and established some early dominance. But the Sierra RS500 was the culmination of what was possible when a car company really put investment into something. It was a car company saying, "We've not done a lot in motorsport recently, we need to show everybody we've still got it." And they did. Not only did the drivers love the car, the fans loved the car, and they still do. An RS500 touring car at a museum, or out on track, or at the Festival of Speed, or even standing still in a museum turns heads. It's one of those performance cars that has become mythical in its status. Not only did it look good and go like the clappers, it set the standard for race preparation and car building. They were also largely bomb-proof, and that 84% success rate is quite insane when you factor in that that's success across the world, not just in Britain. And if you're doing a list of the greatest racing cars of all time, yes, you're going to have the F1 cars from years ago, like the Lotus 49, Lotus 72, McLaren MP44, Ferrari F2002, and so on. Then you're going to have the sports cars, the Porsche 956, Ford GT40, Porsche 919, and the other great sports cars from history. But when you get through all of those cars, you've got one more car to add to the list that often goes under the radar. The ultimate in what one driver described as something that had a horrendous amount of speed. The culmination of that 80s excess just before the 80s gave way to the 90s. The Ford Sierra RS500 Cosworth. The family hatchback turned into a fire-spitting demon. So then, a look at probably the fastest touring car in history, the Ford RS500 Cosworth. If this has been something interesting and a little bit different that you've enjoyed, then do click that like button so I know a good job was done, and for more stuff from the channel, get subscribed and also get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads over at Patreon for the continued support, and if you want to help out with the bills or buying up images for these videos, a link to Patreon will be in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, affiliates and anything else you might want or need to know. Or the super thanks for any one and done donations and memberships so you can do Patreon without the Patreon. So until next time, I've been Aidan, have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.